Hey YouTube, it's Dimitri, and today we're going to do a book review. We're going to talk about The Black Swan by Nassim Taleb. I know a lot of people have talked about this book. This book has been recommended as a read for my financial engineering program. I never got around to reading it. The more I learned, the more I thought this is going to be a waste of my time. But I'm going to try to remain positive for the majority of this video and analyze this more from an analytical perspective and less from a personal, intellectual perspective of kind of the displeasure I had in reading the book. So let's kind of just dive on into the thoughts and theories here. So first off, let's define a black swan, and we're going to use his book to do it. If you go to page, I guess it's the prologue, so it's like XXII, so 22. He states here, I stop and summarize the triplet. So these are the three things that make a black swan. He talks about rarity, extreme impact, and retrospective, which is, having a story or narrative to go with this of the predictability of the event. So what he's trying to say here is that the event is rare, the event is extreme, and that humans will typically try to go back and come up with some story or narrative for this. So the general principle of the book, in a lot of aspects, starts to point out that, we can't predict the future, it's unpredictable, people think it's predictable, people are overconfident, all things I completely agree with, right? I see this in industry and in practice consistently, and I agree with that. But most of the book, I don't know how to put this nicely, but most of the book is more or less like delusional theory, and I feel like this is more or less a book not on math and statistics. It's a book on I'm just displeasured and I'm unhappy with the industry and I have an axe to grind. And so I'm going to go out and I'm going to attack the industry and I'm going to publish this book basically after the financial crisis. And I'm going to go after bankers and financial engineers and everything. I'm going to point the finger and say, you're dumb, you're wrong, and you don't know anything. If you actually read the book, it's pretty arrogant. It talks about how great and wonderful he is. Literally half this book is about just him. So, I don't know. I get it. It's a New York Times bestseller. The reason being is that the American public's upset. We go through a financial crisis. We need someone to blame. So again, we're going to the narrative story here. So though he criticizes the narrative story, I feel like in most parts of this book, he starts narrating. He comes up with some story, some reason. But he's not pointing to the facts. It's going back to this narrative thing. He wants some reason to be upset. He wants some reason to blame the financial markets. And I took a bunch of notes on this book as I read it. And I don't really take notes a lot of times reading books like this. But one thing I want to point out is I would rename the book more or less Business Professional Discovers Science is More Complicated Than His MBA Taught Him. So he goes back and claims to be a quant, which is fine. I'm not going to dispute this, but most of what he's saying is that he just doesn't understand a lot of the probability theory. He doesn't understand stationarity and time series. So a time series is stochastic processes. He points out a lot in the book that he hates the normal distribution. It's unreasonable, and nobody should be using it. And, the Black Scholes is terrible, and he does an axe job at going after Myron Scholes and Robert Merton, and how Ed Thorpe is a genius and he created everything. And don't get me wrong, Ed Thorpe is a really bright guy, and he did come up with the Black Scholes pricing formula before Black, Myron, and Scholes did. But that being said, right, Merton and Fisher Black and Myron Scholes, they came about it from a different perspective. They're trying to connect all these pieces of the puzzle together and answer the question, why? Right? Why is this equation doing what it's doing? Why is the math that way? How do we link this to something logical, right? You can't just apply things blindly. And I think, again, the book's pointing out, this is terrible, right? We shouldn't just be blindly following things. We should be questioning ourselves. We should be more skeptical. And I completely agree with that in the book. But then the book goes to turn on people. It starts cutting out people and calling them by names. Interestingly enough, he does not call out Fisher Black, right? Because Fisher Black did not actually win the Nobel Prize because he died. And there's a whole scandal behind that, and I do believe that they waited for him to die before issuing the Nobel Prize. But again, he doesn't go after Fisher Black. But Fisher Black was one of the biggest components of, putting the theory together and coming from CAPM and financial theory to get to that. So I'm just displeased with the book. A lot of it comes from really weird angles, and I feel like he argues one thing, and then he flops, and he does the exact same argument. So it's okay for him to tell a narrative, but narratives are bad and wrong. And then a lot of times he starts going after quants, and he starts listing off all these attributes. One of the things I noticed is that he goes after them for wearing suits and ties and looking good and talking good, and these people in finance are bad. Real, non-quants and these non-business people and whatever, they don't do that. They don't wear suits. They don't wear ties. I'm super confused reading the book. Like, you're talking about MBA students. You're talking about finance students. You're talking about yourself. Like, I feel like he as a person is kind of upset with himself, and he doesn't really understand his perspective. And so I think he's having this internal struggle, which is realistically, I think, the book. It's an internal struggle of him lashing out at both sides. But a lot of the book talks about how analysts are way overconfident. I see this in industry and practice more so on the business side. I don't see it as much on the quantitative side. When you look at application of models and overconfidence, and prediction error and all these issues, I usually don't see this on the quant side. Usually some quant builds a model, and they bring in this textbook and all this complicated mathematics, and then we dumb it down and we try to simplify it to explain it to the business users, and then they are overconfident and they start using it for applications they shouldn't be using it for. And then, like the financial crisis, some of these quants stood up and said, this is wrong, you shouldn't be doing this. And at the end of the day, who's taking the blame? The quants took the blame because they built the model. But they're not actually looking at the fact the guy using the tool is not using it for the correct method. I mean, it's like saying I'm going to use a chainsaw to cut an avocado open, and I'm going to hold it, I'm going to cut it, and I chop my hand off. Therefore, the manufacturer of the chainsaw is an idiot. Right? It's not the chainsaw manufacturer's fault. It's the idiot using the chainsaw, right? They just don't understand what it's built for. And I'm not saying that quants are 100% out of the clear. A lot of them built models, were overconfident. A lot of them I don't think were actual quants. They're physicists and mathematicians who don't understand financial theory and application. And a lot of them I don't think understand statistics. So understanding math is great, but you have to know probability theory and statistics. And again, I give, Taleb a lot of credit here in the sense that he points this out in the book. He points out, there's people that are overconfident, and I agree, I see this in the industry. But I think a lot of the book is just focused on writing a New York Times bestseller, right? It's easy to go after Wall Street. It's easy to go after these people and say, it's your fault. You did X, Y, and Z. But again, coming back to a lot of like the issues with the book I have, I just don't see, I think he's coming from the perspective of a business person in a trading firm that thinks they're quants, and then he's going after the quants, but they're realistically not quants. They're like business experts, business people, business traders. He also comes at this from the perspective of only the trading side. So I work in the banking side, so not trading. I work in like loans, for example. A lot of the problems I see that he mentions in the book are good points, but at the same time, he only sees this very narrow perspective, and I don't think he really has a lot of expertise and knowledge in the quant realm. So even in like his teaching experience, I know he's taught at NYU, he's coming at this from a business perspective. He's coming at this from his Wharton MBA, which if you don't know, Wharton advertises it's a quantitative MBA. A Wharton grad can't even hold a candle to an actual quant. Like it's kind of laughable if you think about it. But let's just dive into a few of the points here, which kind of like frustrated me with the book, and we'll see kind of what my issues are with his thinking process. So first one, let's mention the narrative story again. One of the things I see as the biggest problem in finance is this double-edged sword. So you have business professionals, which I think he's pointing at. They like to come up with stories for everything. So you can, I've seen models and you build it and the coefficients say it's positive. So the relationship between two variables is positive. When this goes up, this goes up. And they'll come up with some business reasoning and justification and some story, okay? And then somebody will readjust the model because we need to make some corrections. And then all of a sudden the coefficient is negative. So when this goes up, this goes down. And yet now they can come up with a different story, okay? So I agree with him on this on the business side. On the quant side, though, I see the opposite problem. So I see data scientists, for example. I see financial engineers. I see statisticians, mathematicians, physicists, all that. They will take data. They will fit some model to it. And then this is the answer, okay? So in my opinion, this is not the correct way to do it. So what happens, they come up with some model. There's no justification. There's no logic behind the model. It's, this data fits this, and so therefore we regress them, and then we get an answer. So this violates a lot of time series applications. Time series, if you do this correctly, and I've done this at work, you build these models, and you look for stationarity and the independence and the dependent variables and then the residuals. You look for white noise, and then you come up with some theory, right? There has to be a story. Like the data talks to you. So I'm a crazy person, right? People think I'm nuts. But I've done this at work, and I've been training people, and I write a narrative. Like, I have a page story, like 1 to 2 pages, explaining how all these components interact. Why are there lags? Why is the differencing making sense? How do the pieces come together? And why do we see this working in the long run? Okay? So I need a narrative. I think the narrative is something that I do need. I don't need the business people with no clue of the math touting out random nonsense. I think the problem here is you don't have real quants, right? A quant is somebody who's an expert in all these areas. They should be able to take financial theory and pull it back and apply it to the math and come up with like some logical reasoning for how this works and have some story. We know we're not correct. We know we can't predict the future. If you could, there'd be no reason to trade. There'd be no stock market. There'd be no uncertainty. Life would not be exciting. But again, I think the narrative point that he makes applies to the business side because they're recklessly applying stories to everything that aren't logical, and then they can switch things around quickly because they don't really I don't think they really have a solid grasp of finance, even though they have a finance degree and a major, and they don't understand the math. I think quants on the other side, including data scientists now, I don't think they understand the theory as well, and so they just blindly apply things and don't have a solid narrative. So the narrative piece I think you have to have, but I also get his point that the business people I think are delusional and don't understand what they're talking about. Okay, let's dive on in now to his normality issues. So he hates the Swan distribution, the normal distribution, whatever you want to call it here. I don't understand, I understand why somewhat, but for example, he mentions like trading it with a risk measure and how risk is a joke. So I get a lot of subscribers that complain like, oh, risk is useless and nobody should be doing risk management. I'm almost guaranteeing if you're a huge Ed Thorpe groupie and you hate, normal distributions, it's because you've read this nonsensical book. But that being said, if you're using the normal distribution and your data's not normal, you're just dumb. Like, just simply put, right, you're an idiot. Like, why would you use it if it doesn't apply? And again, rewinding here, almost every legitimate financial engineering program teaches like kernel density estimation. So these are non-parametric methods for creating unique distributions. So they're not normal. They don't have any parameters like a normal distribution. So he criticizes the mean. He criticizes standard deviation. Non-parametrics doesn't have any of that. And yet that's what a lot of these trading firms that are legitimate trading firms using quantitative methods are using, because again, their intellectual rigor is much higher than that coming from an MBA or a finance background when it comes to the math. I think, again, this is where he's confusing a lot of this. An MBA is not quantitative. You're not a quant by any stretch of the imagination here. Just because you have the degree in financial engineering doesn't make you a quant. But again, I just don't think he sees the reality here of you should not be using normal distribution. We all know that, right? You're pointing out the obvious. I think, again, he's looking for some fame or something here from the book. So again, I'm not sure why this is such an issue. Going back mathematically now, a lot of things that we do in financial engineering and in finance and in life in general, we're trying to draw conclusions. We need some inference. I need to know that this is causing this. And he points out correlations and starts criticizing the way correlations are calculated. But then I come back and say, are you the idiot that's believing a correlation means causation? And we continually go over that, right? That's not the same thing. You need to have that narrative, again, which he's preaching against. So I think, I don't know, I just don't think he's grasping the full concepts here of everything. And then to go back on this mathematically again, the reason we like the normal distribution is it makes the mathematics complete. So it makes things easier to calculate. And I think this is where the arguments fall apart is one thing I find difficult is teaching statistics to people, like non-parametrics, financial engineering methods, and people get upset and they say, just teach me the good stuff, right? The problem I have is that you have to start at the bottom. Like, I have to teach you probability theory. I have to teach you statistics 101. We have to start with the normal distribution, central limit theorem, getting to that. And then as we start moving forward, which I'm working towards it in my time series videos, normality and central limit theorem only applies under certain conditions. And most financial series don't follow that. Like, that's something we all know, or you should know in finance, right? But again, a lot of our theories depend on that, like the black scholes, right? It depends on that, and we know that's a weakness. We know the issues with it. But then we can also modify it and make it more complicated and use numerical approximation or numerical methods here to get to an answer. But again, it's not closed form solution. It's not simple to understand. But that's the trade-off we're making here. We understand that. We all know that the normal distribution isn't realistically how the financial data falls. So I'm kind of confused why this is even an argument unless you're incompetently applying these methods to your actual derivative trading, right? I don't know. Just Just my confusion here. Maybe he knows, but just pointing that out. So the next thing I want to discuss here is the issue with black swans and shocks. So he makes this argument that almost everything that's like groundbreaking in life goes from like one state and then all of a sudden it just happens and everything explodes and we all lose, right? I don't agree with this in any way, shape, or form. I don't think you can come up with an actual, process for this. Like, I don't think you can justify this in many ways. So he mentions, for example, like the internet, computers, lasers were unplanned discovery, and he starts mentioning these things. But I don't think he understands all of the time and effort that has gone into doing this. So let's just take like computers, for example, or even the internet. Computers, for example, no one came out and said, I don't have my phone on me. Here's this little itty bitty phone, which is essentially a computer, and it just happened overnight. Right? It's slow progress. Somebody went through and started thinking about, like RAM, for example. So I would encourage all of you to actually go out and look at a video on like computer architecture. When you start looking at the history of computers, all these components are like problems. So we built the first computer. University of Michigan has one of this giant wall, and it's a computer. And then we start figuring out, we need to make it smaller, we need to make it faster, we need to make better, memory, for example. So when you have RAM, you can lose memory based on how it's flashed. That's a whole other topic for computer architecture. But we come up with better methods for actually storing short-term memory in a computer. And then processors are super slow, and how do we make that better? I mean, even like hard drives, for example, with moving parts versus, solid-state drives that don't have moving parts. All these things have slowly progressed over time. And it's a bunch of people. Like, this guy came up with this idea, this guy came up with this idea, there's like 10 people with ideas, and then finally somebody can take the different components and put them together and build something great. Right? And I think the iPod is a great example of this for Apple. They took a lot of different components from other people, and Apple's amazing at this. They take all these technologies and they put them together and package them into something that works really, really well. Right? But again, this didn't happen overnight. Some guy didn't just wake up and go, let me grab, two things and put them together, and then bam, I have a new invention and the world changes overnight. I think he's missing the fact that hard work is what actually creates change. And a lot of times stock markets, so again, he's looking at this, I think, from a stock market business perspective. Stock markets might find out about this at one time based on how the SEC requires you to release information, which I think is nonsense. But again, like, nobody knows except for the people inventing it, and then a company implements it, and then you have some spike in price. It's had months to get to that, like even years, decades sometimes, to get to that point. So you actually in the background have this building process where it's actually building up, but you don't see that and it's not reflected in the stock price because a lot of people don't know because it's proprietary. The internet's another great example, right? It was used for military purposes originally. Over time it's developed. When I was a kid, right, I had dial-up, so you had the cool noise, Anyways, and it was super slow and pages would load by like line by line. And yet now it's super fast because computers have gotten better, which makes the internet better. And then the internet has gotten more dynamic. And even though the same concept of the internet was used a long time ago, we can use really cool designs and structures with it to do like social media. And you can do like calculations behind the scenes. So you can put your information in, you can log into accounts. All this wasn't really available when the internet came out. So again, it's not something that just spiked overnight. I don't think these are Black Swan events. Yeah, these are progressions in society, but I don't know what else you would expect, right? That's kind of just how life works. So that's kind of my other issue, is that he thinks everything like has this like jump diffusion, which is another process, but he thinks there's jumps and things. So like stock market prices go and also you have a jump. He thinks in society you have like no technology and then bam, technology, and that happens. I don't agree with this. I don't think there's actually Black Swan events. Okay, something else he points out is linearity and non-linearity. He points out life is non-linear and that we model things linearly, and therefore we're all idiots, and that doesn't make any sense. Again, I think he's way too harsh in a lot of senses here. But the reason we use linearity, so I feel like I'm explaining this to everybody, is because linearity is easy to understand. So it makes it easy to model things. It's easier to understand things. Yeah, we understand the real world's not linear, but if we can break things down linearly, a lot of times we can get great approximations. So again, even like stock pricing, so going back to his perspective, we know we don't know the answer, but if we can decompose it and get something fairly close, we can use that to make money or profit, or to hedge, or to invest long-term for retirement accounts, right? We understand that. It's hard to model things that are non-linear. So neural networks are coming into the picture right now. They do an amazing job on non-linearities. Again, we need better technology. And again, I understand his point here, right? We need to be careful and understand that. But at the end of the day, like pointing out all these problems and then not having an actual solution is kind of just a waste of time. Like, why am I reading this book, right? I understand the obvious. And then he starts to go on part of the book and says, oh, I understand, but you just need to be cautious and take risky bets when things are going to be in your favor, and don't take risky bets when things are going to be against you. But doesn't that kind of violate the principle of a black swan? It's an outlier. It's something you don't see coming. Whole nother issue. Something else just to kind of wrap this up here, because I'm rambling quite a bit on a lot of the issues I had in the book. The other issue is that probability. So they think like the financial crisis just happens, right? Bam, it's done. Well, if you look at financial data, it actually goes up, and then all of a sudden you have the financial crisis, and then it's months or like a year or two, it's going down. So the probability of this event occurring is actually really high. If you look at financial data and you take all the good times, you take the bad times, if you define the bad times as 1 day or 1 second, 1 hour, 1 hour out of like 50 years or something, 100 years, right? It's extremely rare. It should never happen. And yet they're happening all the time. And this is the argument a lot of people start bringing up. Well, if you define it like that, of course, it's going to be extremely rare. But if you look at financial crises, they happen over months and years. So if you had, say, a 50-year or 100-year, say you have a 100-year period for easy math, and you had 7 crises, and there was, each one of them took about a year to come down. So from top to bottom, we're looking at about a year. You start thinking about that's 7 years for 7 crises. So 7 out of 100 is 7%. 7% is pretty high. If you don't expect that and you don't see the cyclicality in markets, I'm not sure how that's a black swan event. And then they start pointing out, well, Dimitri, you couldn't predict it. Of course you can't predict the future. If we all could predict the future, it'd be easy. We'd all know what's going to happen. We'd all make adjustments. And then life would have basically no unexpected events. Stock prices would be essentially these really smooth lines with no jaggedness to them. But that's not the real world. And I think something else he kind of points in the book, but I don't know if he quite sees it, is that, like physics in like the real world is easy to model because it follows laws. Okay? But social sciences like finance and people, right? Social sciences, which is like economics, there's no hard laws because people change. People do things differently. You're always going to have outliers. And he mentions in the book too that we should consider the outliers. We shouldn't be trimming them. Completely agree. I think it's awesome. Good point there, right? I have a video even on that about you should not get rid of outliers because they actually add value into your modeling, and it helps show you stressed periods and stressed events, one-offs, mismeasurements. If they are mismeasurements, you can take them out, but if they're not, you should leave them. But again here, it's just defining probabilities is something that changes your perspective on it here. So if you're defining, right, these events as super small, then of course it's going to be non-existent and they should never happen. But in general, I just think it's way oversimplified, which is part of the argument of the book, that we oversimplify things. And yet I feel the book is oversimplifying everything and ignoring a lot of issues. And just kind of to rewrap this up, right, I think the stationarity issue of time series, making them stationaries for modeling purposes, I've seen this almost every bank I've been to, every industry practitioner I've talked to. 99.999% of all these people don't understand the importance of it and how it predicts to modeling. So people are going to say, Dimitri, you can't see the future. We shouldn't model anything. Well, if you don't want to do that and it's too risky for you, then just get out of the finance market. But financial professionals are being paid to actually do this. And again, another great point he makes in the book, which I do like, is, the so-called experts aren't always experts. Completely agree with that. A lot of people that are experts in finance, medicine, other areas don't have a clue what they're doing. They're uneducated. They lack the rigor. Again, pushing for that rigor here in quants to understand that and do that. But at the end of the day here, right, a lot of this book, I think, comes down to the fact there's a misinterpretation of probabilities and stationarity. Stationarity implies stability over long periods of time. Most stocks don't display this, but if you can detrend them in a way to make them stationary, you can have better predictions moving forward. It does not guarantee you anything. Life is unpredictable. The stock market's unpredictable, right? You can't predict the future. We already know that. But if you're being paid, and the problem is I need to predict the future, you have to come up with some methods. We know they're not perfect. That should be obvious to almost everybody reading this, but I'm guessing it's not based on the number of copies it's sold. We already know all this. It's just pointing out the basics. So yeah, it's hard to predict the future. We know that. We do have methods for trying to grasp that. But again, being irresponsible and not including those, which he does point out, and I give him credit for that, right? That's part of the problem, but also coming from it from a business perspective, pretending to be a quant, and then trying to put the pieces together, and then pointing out obvious things we already know, and then not using the proper methods like stationarity and data transformations to make things more predictable. I don't know, I just can't buy the book in a lot of senses, which makes me want to wrap this up with one other comment here. If you want to read something that is, I think, of more value, something that points out a lot of the same problems, but from an actual quantitative perspective, something more dynamic, something I feel like comes from it from an actual practitioner perspective, but also points out a lot of the issues with the industry. So again, I'm not saying the industry is perfect. I agree a lot with what Taleb is saying, but at the same time, I think the book's a lot of rubbish. And one thing that rubbed me the wrong way was him using the story of, let's see, Yevgenia, I don't know how you pronounce it. There's some story of this Russian lady, and then I think after time he got discovered he made up the story, so now he has to put a footnote in the book because I have the second edition, and then he keeps mentioning her later in the book. Don't make stories up if they're not real, like, or just blatantly say, like, this is an example of what could happen. But again, trying to use a story as an actual example and claiming it's real, and then I feel like you got caught, and then you're trying to unwind it, it just takes away from the validity of your book even more. So in general, I don't recommend you read The Black Swan. I think it's a waste of your time. If you want to read something that's actually good, I would recommend Models of Behaving Badly by Emmanuel Derman. This is one of my favorite books. I'm a big fan of Emmanuel Derman in general. I do not agree with him on a lot of things, so I'm by no means like a groupie or a super fan. But his book points out, I think, more clearly a lot of the issues with the financial crisis, the overconfidence on both sides of both quants and business professionals, and abusing models, not using them correctly, and realizing that, like, we're approximating things, but that you can't actually calculate things like physics. So he's a physicist by training. He points out physics is like a hard science. You calculate some answer, and that's the answer. But he points out in soft, like social sciences, you can't actually do that. So I think that book's more well-rounded. It gets more to the actual points, and it has more validity in the way it's presented. And not to mention, the book is actually thinner, and it cuts to the chase. Like, this was really enjoyable to read. This one I really struggled with. Like, it was just a tough read, because so much of it I felt like was so wrong. I could point out issues with it. Again, I think he's oversimplifying a lot of it. I don't know if he's doing that to make it more reader-friendly, but I think a lot of the conclusions he's drawn are incorrect and not very accurate. So, anyways, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And as always, until next time.